You for the introduction, Sherry. I appreciate it and I'm really excited about the conversation today. When we get a chance to visit and connect as clinicians, then we have an opportunity to talk about some extended benefits and how psilocybin can be helpful both for ourselves as individual humans, but then also for the clients that we work with. So, microdosing is something that's very different from those macrodose experiences. And so, my goal today is really just to enhance that curiosity, talk about the problems that we want to solve, talk about some of the differences with psilocybin and some of the other things that we have access to at this point, and really get into, why do we care that psilocybin has been decriminalized? So let's jump in here. Again, let's start with why do we care? So great, certain states have started decriminalizing. We're having more conversation about the research behind psychedelics and as a whole. Psilocybin is just one of those classic psychedelics, but that is one that has been more openly welcomed into our society at this point than some of the others and has extensive research on it as well. So when we look though at what is the purpose and what is the goal of doing this research, we have to look at the mental health trends. So these trends are just taken from some 2025 data from the CDC National Center for Health Statistics. Talks a lot about depression. I mean, to have a 60% increase over the past decade of depression in US adolescents and adults is very significant. And for 40% of people 12 and older with depression to have received counseling or therapy from a health professional is showing that people want help. They want to have something different happening. They don't want to stay in the same mindset and the same struggles that they're in right now. But what we have is a lot of old information. So as they're seeking help, and we're continuing to try and use the information that we have had access to, information and pharmaceuticals we've had access to, we're continuing to see these mental health trends go in a direction that's not what we're looking for. So being in a discussion today specifically about Colorado, let's look at some of these, Colorado statistics. We are in the top 10 nationally for suicide, divorce, and domestic violence. And just looking at those three issues themselves, all of those are going to have underlying conditions that are affiliated with them. And they're also going to be, they're all things that connect with others outside of the one individual. So no human is an island. It's evident that the way that we feel, the way that we act, the way that we respond always is going to impact the people around us. So when we look at these mental health trends of depression, anxiety, suicide, divorce, domestic violence, those are connected not just to individual people, but to our culture as a whole. And that's part of why we care, that we need to do something about what's happening with the mental health status of individuals. So where is this deterioration coming from? I mentioned a lot of it's coming from old information, definitions, and ideas. And what I mean by that is, as human beings, we are born without definitions. We show up in the world as these cute little tiny sweet babies that don't even know the difference between light and dark, warm and cold. We just appear. And, obviously there's science that goes behind that, but we show up without an expectation. There's no baby that is born as like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to like it here. Let me give some thought to this. No, they just are existing. With that idea of a human being is that state of just being. But as that child ages, then they are given definitions and they're given information. This is cold, this is hot, this is light, this is dark, this is red and green and black. And then we get into more complex things. This is what love means. This is acceptance. This is rejection. This is what it looks like to be successful. This is what happens if you're not successful. And so we hold on to those and compound those definitions and ideas as we go forward. And then we show up at some point in our early to middle adulthood wondering why our life looks the way we do, what the way that it does, and why do I even think the way that I think? Or we end up in a therapy office or a physician office saying, hey, I don't feel like myself. We know something is off. I'm not motivated. I'm gaining weight. I don't want to do anything. My brain never shuts down. It's never quiet. Those are all things that come from thought itself. And so thought is what precedes all of our actions and everything that we decide to do and go forward in our life, but it also is what precedes what we think about ourselves. So that idea of the self, what we reference as the ego, holds a lot of power because we put a lot into that. So, research shows that chronic stress is certainly a risk factor for depression and other mood disorders. I think you'd be hard pressed at this point in time to find an adult that is saying that they don't have stress in their life. Nobody has come to my office and said, "Hey, Charity, I'm just here because I'd really like to have more anxiety or more stress, or more depression." Nobody says that. It's always, I want less. I want my mind to be quiet. I want less anxiety. I want these things that I don't have control over to not impact me so significantly. So we know though that with that stress, there's both structural and functional atrophy in the brain. And there's two really key components of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is all of our executive functioning, and the hippocampus, which is connected to memory and learning. Those are not areas that we want atrophy in. So when we look at how is psilocybin going to be helpful with these things, a lot of it has to do with that structure of the brain itself. So let's talk just briefly about our current treatment modalities. Of course, we have pharmaceuticals. These are typically our SSRIs, SNRIs, lots of other psychotropics that we can add into there. We have talk therapy. I like to kind of equate talk therapy with a pressure cooker. When we talk about stress and we talk about anxiety, that's something that builds over time. And what ends up happening is there has to be a release point. And so often when somebody is coming to talk therapy, they need something that's going to release the pressure. So when we're pressure cooking food, at some point when it beeps, you click the little button on top and then all the steam comes out. That's that pressure release. That is, I think, a great analogy for talk therapy. Somebody comes to an office, they talk to somebody about what's on their brain, they get that pressure release. They leave feeling better because there's been conversation about it. There's been some new ideas that have been discussed. But taking that information and going and implementing it into daily life is much more challenging. And so what happens? They come back the next week. Okay, all this pressure has built up again. Maybe I made a few little advances here and there, but I'm still back to talk because I feel better when I talk. So talk therapy can itself become a coping technique. There are certainly, clients I know at some point I've said, what are we doing? We've been having these weekly meetings for an extended period of time now, and you come back and we talk about the same things. We need to look at the goals, or we need to look at a different way to have discussion around some of these things that are happening. That's really where psilocybin has been incredibly helpful. So, and then other therapeutic techniques, EMDR, of course, TMS, hypnosis. There's all the T's, the DBT, the CBT, all the T's out there, and various techniques that we've come up with that we again have had for an extended period of time. So this is not a knock on our current treatment modalities. It's just saying we've been doing this. And yet, when we look at the statistics, mental health is getting worse, not better. So where do we need to make a shift to have something else that we can do, something else that we can offer to actually bring some life back into these mental health processes that we're trying to enhance? So let's talk about psychedelics. Psychedelics as a class are the classics that directly impact the serotonin system. So ketamine, MDMA, those are not classic psychedelics. Those impact different systems. We're talking about the classics, which is where psilocybin lands, as well as LSD, mescaline, DMT. Those act on those 5-HT2A serotonin receptors. They all have some very similar effects, excuse me, altering perception, thought, mood, those sorts of things, but they also have indigenous and ceremonial roots to them. So to say, okay, where did this idea of using a psychedelic even come from? I'm big on definitions. If we're going to talk about how definitions complicate life, then we need to talk also about how definitions enhance our conversations. Words are important. So if we look at the root of the word psychedelic, psyche in Greek means the mind, and then delic is to make clear or manifest. So using a psychedelic literally is contributing to a clearing of the mind or manifesting what is in the mind. Psilocybin is something that turns you inward. What is in my own thoughts? what is in my own belief systems. We've been trained to really look outside of ourselves for answers, and that's what a lot of the mental health world has been. Those things we just mentioned. You have to go to a clinician to get pharmaceuticals. You have to go to a therapist of some sort to have talk therapy or to do any of those other techniques. But each person is the expert on themselves. They just don't know it yet. And that's where psilocybin is such a helpful tool to be able to help us see ourselves in a different way. So, a clearing of the mind, the way I interpret that, is really clearing away all the distractions, what I call kind of those floating variables of just irritants that happen throughout the day. And then manifesting what is in the mind is, what are the belief systems, the ideas, the concepts that you hold on to that are at the root of how you make decisions on a daily basis and how you view yourself and other people? So let's look specifically at psilocybin as that classic psychedelic. Psilocybin is fully natural. There's no modification needed to it. It metabolizes to psilocin, and yes, there are probably 15 different ways you can say the word psilocin, however you want to say it, but that's my pronunciation of it. That is what is metabolized within the body. So psilocin is a naturally occurring tryptamine. It's found in the psilocybe mushrooms, of which there are lots of different species of the psilocybe mushroom itself. But Colorado has decriminalized really psilocybe cubensis. So it has not been just this big overall, hey, you can use any psilocybin containing mushroom. They do have different properties to them, but psilocybe cubensis is the most common. It is the one that's used when we're talking about scientific research 99% of the time. And it binds to the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. So when we look at the chemical structure of psilocin, it is so close to serotonin that it perfectly fits that serotonin receptor. I just love how, as natural beings, it makes sense that nature would have what we need if we know how to use it appropriately. We are all made of the same stuff, the same organic materials. And so being able to use nature in that way, I just love how it just perfectly fits those receptors to say, like, hey, I've been created just for this purpose. So let me come alongside and help you. So that serotonin response is really what we're looking at. And it works the same way both in a large dose and a small dose. In a large dose, though, when we look at what is happening in a macrodose experience, it really is a significant disruption of the serotonin system. And that's where you get those hallucinogenic effects. So let's look a little bit just at the roots of, where has psilocybin been used in the past. We won't spend too much time here, but I do think it's important to have discussion recognizing that, this wasn't something that just all of a sudden one day in 1950, somebody decided to take some mushrooms and see what happened. For thousands of years, mushrooms have been used in indigenous practices. And typically, a shaman or a spiritual guide is present to ensure safety for those ceremonial participants and to guide the experience. Again, these are often larger dose sessions. They are used often in combination with music and other rituals and chanting to enhance the experience. But the whole goal is insight, connection, and healing. So even when we go back thousands of years, that was the goal of the mushroom in these indigenous practices as well: insight, connection, and healing. And just often when we're talking about these larger doses, they are viewed in a more spiritual component, a little more existential, to use another word as well. But remember, again, psilocybin is turning you inward and toward yourself. So that's where a lot of these benefits happen. So some of the research, past research, I'm not going to read the entire screen here. You guys can take a picture of it if you want to, or come back to it. But we can really look at when research started being recorded was around 1957, when that article came out in Life magazine after Gordon Wasson went down to Mexico and detailed that experience with psilocybin mushrooms. Throughout 1960 and 70, continued to have more therapeutic research that was done. And then, as we all know, in 1970 is when the Controlled Substances Act classified psilocybin as a Schedule I substance, really out of fear and a lack of understanding and a desire to have a little bit more control over society at that point in time. I don't think there's judgment that goes along with that, but it's always easy to look to the past and say, hey, shoulda, coulda, woulda back there, what if? but we have to look at that's the information they had at that point in time. And so anyway, in 1970, got classified as a Schedule I substance, is still federally classified as that at this point in time. But moving forward to 1992, the Hefter Research Institute was founded to really promote the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. So although in 1970 we can say technically things were kind of put on pause, it's evident that there was a lot of research that was still happening behind the scenes and underground, so to speak. And we appreciate that those scientists continue doing all of that work, because that is what has brought us to where we are now, where even in 2016, Johns Hopkins University was able to demonstrate that psilocybin could produce significant and sustained decreases in depression and anxiety. Specifically, that research was with terminal cancer patients. But as recently as 2020, the FDA granted the breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin specifically for depression. And of course, the research has continued to go forward. So there's ongoing research with areas such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, addiction, ADD, ADHD, Lyme disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, all sorts of things that are being looked at now. So I think it's a really exciting time to be involved in the psilocybin world, and seeing all of this information come to light, really just in ways that we can say, look, there's proof, if that's what we want to call it. But here's science that's showing exactly what's happening in the brain and why it's helpful. So let's dig into the science. I am a total self-proclaimed geek. I love to read research. I like to talk about the science of what's happening. So bear with me as I get super excited in this part. But let's look at some key areas of the brain that are impacted by psilocybin. One thing that's often put out is that it's just a placebo effect, especially when we're talking about microdosing. It is really hard to research microdosing because the whole goal with research is to control variables. In order to say there's a specific outcome, they have to be able to say, well, it wasn't this and this didn't throw it off, and we controlled all these things over here. That is much easier to do with a macro experience. Oftentimes they will require the individuals are already off of their SSRIs or any other psychotropic meds. They have to be certain gender and age and health status, and then they have to come into an office and be able to be there for, let's say, 6 to 8 hours with specific pre-treatment and follow-up or integration sessions with that same team. So there's a lot of control with variables when they're doing a large dose session like that. With a microdose, it's here's your 0.1 of a gram, go to work. Go live your life. Go take care of your family. There are 100,000 different uncontrolled variables in any individual's life. So when we look at microdosing research, a lot of it is what we call self-report, meaning we put a survey out there and people tell us the benefits that they're finding. They talk about what dose they're using and, what are they noticing, if there's any contraindications or any effects that they're having that they don't want. And that's really what we have right now when we look at what we would call peer-reviewed scientific research about microdosing. So instead, I like to say, let's also look at the brain, because science is also a lot of if and then. If this is true, then we can theorize that this also would be true. So if there's really key areas of the brain that are being impacted with psilocybin use in large doses, those same areas of the brain and the body are going to be impacted by psilocybin use in smaller doses, but not in such a disruptive way. In a way where we're getting benefits, but we're not saying, hey, you got to take 6 to 8 hours out of your life to go have this experience. So the first key area of the brain is the amygdala. The amygdala is where fight or flight, fear, hypervigilance, a lot of other emotional responses arise from. It's located in the back of the brain, and this is an area of the brain that is actually blood flow is increased to it by SSRIs and SNRIs. So when we look at why would that potentially be, if we're trying to get someone out of a hypervigilant state of being, increasing blood flow to that area can actually get them to more of a flat response space, which of course is one of the things a lot of people complain about with SSRIs and SNRIs. They feel like I don't have emotions. I feel like a robot, kind of just this flattened effect. So that is one reason that can happen. Psilocybin reduces blood flow to the amygdala. we're not trying to get rid of emotional responses. We're trying to have some pause between I feel this emotion and I'm going to act or respond in a certain way. So reducing blood flow to the amygdala means we're no longer in that fight or flight hypervigilance state, which is especially helpful when we talk about things like PTSD. Any type of post-traumatic stress, the body is responding to a feeling or an emotional trigger, or a trigger that elicits an emotion or feeling of some sort, and it's autonomically responding. It has been trained that when I feel this way, I need to respond a certain way for survival. So reducing blood flow to the amygdala. Exciting that frontal lobe of the brain. We talked at the beginning how stress over time compromises the prefrontal cortex. Well, again, the prefrontal cortex is our focus, our creativity, executive functioning, forward planning, a kind of interpretation of what's happening, setting goals, those sorts of things. Those are all really important. One good reference point for how substances can negatively impact the prefrontal cortex is marijuana and alcohol. Both of those depress the prefrontal cortex. So when we talk about symptoms like anxiety, and people say, I just need to calm down, I need to quiet down. Well, if we're having all of this excitement in the frontal lobe of the brain, and then we throw a wet blanket on it, which is really what marijuana and alcohol do, then yes, it's going to quiet everything down. But that's not something that promotes healing. That's something that is saying, shh, be quiet, and then that's going to wear off, and we're left with everything that was already there before. We're coming back to the exact same things. Nothing has changed except it was put on pause for a while, and then we're coming back to it. So psilocybin, by exciting that prefrontal cortex of the brain, more focus, more creativity, more ability to be in one place and be fully present. Forward thinking, goal setting, planning, long-term organization. Those are all things that are helpful to a human deciding what do I want to get out of my life. We need to have that prefrontal cortex fully functioning. And then quieting the default mode network. So if we're kind of going through a brief, fast neuroscience anatomy thing, amygdala in the back of the brain, prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain, default mode network in the middle. Now, if a neuroscientist is listening to this at some point in time, please do not email me that the DMN is both those areas are part of the DMN. They technically are, but the goal in really breaking it down is what do each of those areas serve? The default mode network is all of our inner chatter. Remember those definitions, ideas, belief systems that we talked about, the way that we perceive the world, the ways that we learn to understand and to respond to the world for self-preservation purposes. All of that is really held in that default mode network, as is the idea of the self. What does this mean about me? When this other person is responding to me a certain way, well, how should I interpret that as far as my value? I like to talk about the fact that we walk around going into these social situations and wondering, man, am I okay? What do they think about me? Am I coming across as smart enough or funny enough or helpful enough or rich enough or whatever it might be that we want to show up as so that we think other people will accept us? But what are the other people thinking? Wow, I wonder what they're thinking about me. Am I smart enough? Am I funny enough? Am I rich enough? Those conversations are internal within all humans. We think it's only us because we are in our own mind, but it's everybody walking around. We're all reflecting from other people back to the self. What are you telling me about me and how you respond to me? So by quieting that default mode network, that's really where we have an opportunity to be open to new perspectives, new ideas, going back to that idea of talk therapy, going to your clinician and having these conversations that just relieve pressure and stress at the moment is great, except that if your brain is fighting against you the whole time because it's trapped in rigid thinking and that default mode network is just going 150 miles an hour, then you don't really have an opportunity to integrate all of that amazing information that the clinician is helping you with. Instead, it's just like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then you leave and it's like, yeah, that'll never work. We decide these outcomes based off of past experiences. I mean, how many times have we heard that as clinicians? Oh, yeah, I tried that, it didn't work. Okay, do you want to try it again? Do you want to modify it a little bit? But we're like, nope, this fits into my box of understanding. And so that's how I view the world, whether it's religious, cultural, political, again, past traumatic experiences, all of those play a part in that. So quieting the default mode network is one of the biggest ways that psilocybin is beneficial because that is the key area that's really connected to how do we think and how do we interpret the world around us. All right, like I said, lots of science. So let's talk a little bit about these enhanced serotonin effects. Psilocybin does not impact natural serotonin production. It is so important to recognize that because that is where a lot of the withdrawal symptoms show up for individuals who are trying to titrate off of SSRIs or SNRIs. Those pharmaceuticals specifically tell the brain to hold on to the serotonin that's available, not to reuptake it or utilize it. And so the body is like, cool, I have enough of this. I don't need to keep making serotonin. Well, then when you try and titrate off that particular medication, you miss a day, you feel kind of weird. You miss 2 days, you're definitely not feeling great. And by day three, you're like, well, my gosh, where's my meds? I need to just go back on this. That is because of the serotonin deficiency gap that happens. When the brain is not naturally making serotonin, due to using the SSRI or SNRI, then when we start titrating that medication as that half-life diminishes, then the brain is saying, hey, I don't have any of this. I'm not going to feel good. It's connected to our sleep, our sexual function, our digestion, our mood, the how we handle stress. What our attention and our focus is, all of those are touched on by serotonin being available. So again, if we go back to the fact that the psilocin molecule has a chemical structure so close to serotonin that it perfectly fits that receptor, it elicits the same benefits of serotonin without touching natural serotonin production. So you can start microdosing with psilocybin while you are still on your SSRI or SNRI, and we don't have to worry about serotonin toxicity because we're not touching natural production of serotonin itself. It's just eliciting those same benefits. And that will help bridge the gap for that serotonin deficiency while individuals titrate off of those medications. I think another area that's really key to highlight is that SSRIs impact the 5-HT1A receptor, which is very passive. It's more of I'm stressed and now I feel less stressed. Whereas psilocybin or psilocin attaches to that 5-HT2A receptor, which is very active and more of I feel stressed. Why do I feel stressed? Or I'm feeling anxious. Why am I feeling anxious? So it changes the response. It doesn't just diminish the effect. When we talk about things like depression, though, for a long time, it was theorized that depression was due to having an insufficient amount of serotonin. And research now has really shown that depression is a neuroplasticity issue. Depression is that the brain is stuck in that rigid old way of thinking and it can't get out of it. It's stuck in that negative thought, that self-defeating thought loop. And so in order to be able to break out of that, we have to enhance neuroplasticity. And so our brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, is what's really connected to neuroplasticity. Highest concentration is in the hippocampus. Oh wait, that area of the brain sounds familiar. Yeah, remember slide number 1? Consistent stress contributes to functional and structural decline, particularly within the hippocampus and that prefrontal cortex. So when we're talking memory and learning and that neuroplasticity benefit, that is the hippocampus. And so psilocin being able to enhance this brain-derived neurotrophic factor really enhances and rebuilds a lot of that structural decline and functional decline that has happened in the hippocampus. And then also high concentration in the cortex. Again, back to that cortex, emotional regulation, executive functioning. So a reduced amount of this brain-derived neurotrophic factor is the core factor in the pathophysiology of depression. So when we're looking at depression, this is what we really need to be focused on. Psilocin enhances the specific receptor that increases the expression of BDNF. And psilocin has a 1,000 times affinity for TRKB over SSRIs. That's where we get these rapid antidepressant effects. When somebody finds the dose that is helpful to them of psilocybin, they know that day. We do not need to go through a 3-month loading phase, also measuring a bunch of inconvenient and unhelpful side effects that we don't want. When you find the dose that is helpful to you, you know that day. And the cool thing is that dose doesn't change. You can play with it a little bit. You start to understand it. What is this dose that's most helpful to me? How is it helpful? How do I want to use this? But the body does not develop a tolerance to psilocybin when you're microdosing. Over time, you will need less, not more, because it is a healing modality. What happens with SSRIs, though? Over time, we definitely need more and more and more and more and more. So I think that is one of the other really cool differences, just when we're looking at the structural part of the brain itself, where are these benefits showing up? How are they helpful? How do we know this is helpful? And, what do we want to do with it? So again, just a few differences. Psilocybin is all natural. SSRIs, of course, are chemical compounds. Now, to be fair, the chemicals that are in these compounds are also natural, but they are put together in unnatural ways. And so when we start just chemically recreating things and putting them together, the body is not going to respond to them in the same way that it's going to respond to something that is 100% natural. Psilocybin doesn't need any modification whatsoever. Even sometimes there's companies out there that have gummies. Well, in order to have a gummy, you've extracted the psilocin or the active ingredient. In order to extract, you've added heat and chemicals. So now you have, in essence, modified nature in order to create something that you're saying is all natural. So just a little side note there, kind of pay attention even to how you're getting the psilocin or the psilocybin, and how much has it been modified from its natural place. Psilocybin is fast acting, that affinity for that TRKB receptor. You find your microdose in days, and those benefits are immediate. With the SSRIs, again, takes weeks or months to find that maintenance dose is most helpful, again, based off that half-life. Little to no side effects with psilocybin. Side effects, first let's define a side effect. A side effect is an unwanted effect. Side effect means I have these effects I'm getting that I want, but I have these other things I'm getting that I don't want. So when we use that term, I just want to kind of clarify what that is. So with psilocybin, having these benefits that I want, but maybe I'm finding that I'm kind of tired, or maybe I'm finding that I get a headache sometimes. Maybe I'm finding that my gut responds a little bit, irritated to it every once in a while. Again, we are natural beings. There can be things that some people experience, but all of those things can be mediated. Make sure you're drinking enough water. Take some ginger with it, or use it in a tea or in a honey to alleviate some of those gut things. I've worked with a number of clients who had IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, a lot of inflammation in the gut. And they actually, all of them have found that those symptoms have completely gone away by microdosing, because the fungi as a family has natural anti-inflammatory properties to it. So when we talk about what we'll call unwanted effects when it comes to psilocybin, those are things we can experience just by eating certain foods. So pay attention to your body, listen to your body and how it's responding. And if there's things that are happening, then again, maybe I want to skip a day, maybe I want to cut back on that dose a little bit. There's a lot of things that can be done to mediate that. But then if we look at the side effects or unwanted effects with the pharmaceuticals, we're looking at being tired, gaining weight, having sexual side effects, needing more medications to offset the effects that might be happening. So then we end up with cocktails of more pharmaceuticals and unhealthy relationships, and feeling like there's something more wrong with us. Great, my depression has resolved a little bit, but it's also kind of cost me in all these other ways. So, it's not, I don't need any red and blue lights to bring to light the fact that there's a lot of effects from pharmaceuticals that people complain about. But I think this is a great side-by-side comparison. Psilocybin reducing blood flow to the amygdala, not in that hyper-vigilant fight or flight state. Pharmaceuticals increasing. Psilocybin again eliciting the benefits of serotonin, but not touching natural serotonin production at all, whereas SSRIs do compromise that. And psilocybin really, the biggest thing is it promotes healing through changes whereas SSRIs cover up symptoms. And we talked about that 5-HT1A receptor site is a passive, diminishing the effects of things site. 5-HT2A is active, coping mechanism and healing, promoting change. It would be unfair to talk about how great psilocybin is without discussing a little bit some of the other psychedelic options that are out there. And I'm only really going to go into one today because it is the one that is most common because it's currently FDA approved and accessible, and that is ketamine. So ketamine is not technically a psychedelic. It is definitely not a classic psychedelic. It doesn't touch the serotonin system at all. And remember, all those classic psychedelics, that's how we categorize those, is because they impact the serotonin system. So ketamine is a pharmaceutical compound. You can get it through an IV or an intramuscular injection or a nasal spray. Those are the three most common. And it is an NMDA antagonist. So what that means is it actually blocks the NMDA receptor to elicit a big glutamate release. And of course, glutamate is a precursor to having more GABA, and which is very calming, but it also dissociates you or detaches you from yourself. So let me go back that up a little bit and go through that a little bit slower. Ketamine blocks the NMDA receptor to create something that the body doesn't naturally do to then separate you from yourself or from your thinking. Psilocybin connects to a receptor naturally to promote and enhance what the body is already naturally doing and turns you more towards yourself and connects you to yourself. Again, when we're looking at nature and we're looking at chemical compounds and pharmaceuticals, it is worth noting that that is how most psychotropic medications work. Block something to create something to shut everything off or cover everything up. The problem with that is that whole process is just a coping mechanism. Nothing gets healed in that because all we're doing is covering everything up. And if we're covering things up, we're not dealing with the reality of what is. And so after 50 years of covering everything up, we're left with all the statistics from slide 1, which is more depression, more anxiety, more domestic violence, more addiction. So our coping mechanisms are not working, pharmaceutical or otherwise. With psilocybin, these antidepressant effects last for weeks to months. And again, really, they last lifetime if you're consistent with it. And we'll talk about that in a minute because of the way you're healing and changing the way you think. But with ketamine, antidepressant effects last days per dose. You have to continue to go back. You go and have an experience, and then you have to go back. You are limited to a certain number of sessions, though, because again, we are creating something unnatural within the body. Also, we know ketamine's addictive. Special K. It has its own street name. Ketamine is an addictive substance. To use something that we know is addictive in order to help with addiction or other mental health issues seems like just digging a deep, dark hole for the individuals that are participating in it. Psilocybin has been shown to be not addictive. It is not a direct dopamine stimulant, and there's a downline stimulation of dopamine as far as being able to be in a more enhanced state of being, but it is not addictive. And not only is it not physiologically addictive, it is also not psychologically addictive because it doesn't just cover up the thoughts. It doesn't just say, hey, this is all quiet now, don't think about it. It actually promotes us thinking in a different way. Remember, reducing that blood flow to the amygdala, we're not coming from such an emotional response. That quieted default mode network, we're able to think differently about the things that we're experiencing, question some of our responses, and then choose something different, prefrontal cortex outcome. With ketamine, again, that cognitive flexibility, that neuroplasticity, very short term. Synaptogenesis benefits are extremely brief. Whereas with psilocybin, it's very long term, and something that's used in a lot of measured studies is our openness our willingness to be open to ourselves, to the people around us, to feel more connected. Those are all benefits that come with psilocybin. Now, so now that it's like, well, ketamine is clearly the devil, then we don't want to use that. No, ketamine can have its place. And I do think it's important to mention that. The place that ketamine can be most helpful is for individuals that are really stuck in those deep, rigid, depressive thought loops, especially the individuals that are having more suicidal ideations. If someone is in an active suicidal ideation place, giving them a dose of psilocybin, whether it's small or large, which again turns them inward to think more about themselves, is not likely to be helpful in that moment. I do not recommend large dose psilocybin sessions or even high dose microdosing for individuals that are in that mindset. Ketamine is helpful there because it does act fast and it snaps them out of that way of thinking. It is an immediate pause because it blocks that NMDA receptor and gives this huge glutamate response. So they separate from the thought process. That is helpful. Okay. Wow, I don't want to kill myself. This is crazy, to use again non-clinical crazy terminology there, but I need to do something different. Okay, great. Now we've got you out of that mindset. Now we can talk about potentially integrating psilocybin in a microdosing protocol because they want to connect back to themselves. How did I get to that mindset? Why am I thinking this way? Let's undo some of these unhelpful ways of thinking. But ketamine can have its place, but it is a short-term tool, and it is known to be addictive. So I think those are the important things to take away. All right, so we've talked a lot about the science of it, what's it doing. Now let's talk about what is microdosing. Microdosing is using a small dose over an extended period of time to create a long-term change. What is this goal with a long-term change? We're talking about healing. We don't heal in a day. Healing happens over time. If we decide we're going to go up to the mountains and go skiing and then, hit a rock and the leg goes the wrong direction and you've got an ACL tear or a bone break, you're going to go to a trauma surgeon who's going to get everything set. I kind of equate that to a macrodose. All right, let's put everything back together. Let's have this big awakening experience. It's all set now, but then what happens? Now you have your surgery. You're in a post-op boot or a cast, depending, usually a post-op boot. At some point in time, they're going to say, now you need to go to physical therapy. And then after physical therapy, you'll be like, now I need to build the muscle back up. It is a long-term process for the body to heal. Similarly, it's a long-term process for our brain to heal also. To really change the way we think is not something that happens in a weekend moment. We can have new perspective. We can certainly have an understanding that we didn't have previously. We can look at traumatic experiences in a new way. These would all be examples of macrodosing, taking a very high dose all at one time to gain some insight. Have that massive serotonin shakeup. What is my brain trying to show me? What does it want to tell me about how it has been helping me by protecting me from these traumatic things that I've experienced in the past? Or maybe it doesn't have to be attached to a trauma. A large dose can be helpful just in really thinking, understanding why we're in specific thought and behavioral loops that we find ourselves in. Why am I always choosing this type of relationship? Why am I allowing people to treat me a certain way? Why is it that no matter what I do, I feel like I'm not enough? All those messages come from somewhere. Again, these tiny little baby humans that come out are not thinking those things. They think they're amazing. If you hang out with a 5-year-old for longer than 2 minutes, you're going to hear about how awesome they are because that's what they're excited to share. If you think about a 2-year-old first thing in the morning, you don't see 2-year-olds that are all depressed and when the sun comes up. No, that's an adult thing. Adults are like, oh my gosh, the sun's up another day. 2-year-olds are like, woohoo, the sun's up. Another day, excited. They don't know yet all these things that they have to go through. But that is how our thinking shifts over time. And then when the way that we think and understand the world shifts, we get stuck in that and we become very modified in the way that we think. We're no longer that natural self of how we've showed up. So microdosing gives us those small doses to impact the brain in those areas and in the ways that we've just talked about over an extended period of time to create long-term change. That's why it's a healing modality. Yes, it's enhancing neuroplasticity, which is, structurally and functionally helping the brain. Yes, we're getting enhanced serotonin type benefits, quieting down all the inner chatter, no longer having what I like to call squirrel brain. We're focused on one thing at a time, really determining what do I want for my life. But that all happens because also we are changing the way that we think. Don't have to be separated from daily life. You are fully present in daily life with microdosing. Correct microdose means you are still driving your car, going to work, taking care of friends, family, pets, responsibilities, or using an amount that is so small that it is subhallucinogenic, no hallucinogenic aspects, but it is not subperceptual. You absolutely should perceive something. This is not a multivitamin, right? We're all good about taking our multivitamins, especially in the winter. I don't want to get sick. Take that vitamin C and zinc and, all the stuff that's going to keep my immune system functioning. Psilocybin is not our multivitamin. Psilocybin is helpful in using those small doses, but you should absolutely perceive a change. Wow, I noticed my brain's a little quieter. I noticed that that person at work that usually just kind of drives me crazy and irritates me, not quite so irritating today. I just kind of blew it off. I noticed that when I was driving on the interstate and someone turned their blinker on, I let them in. Imagine that. We get so caught up in ourself and in what we are doing, where we are going, and what we're trying to accomplish. We don't pause to think about why we're doing those things. And that is a huge part of what microdosing helps us to do. The dose generally starts around 100 milligrams, sometimes less. 0.05 of a gram is a great place to start because a lot of people don't really notice anything at that, but it tells the amygdala, remember fear, hey, I don't have to be afraid of this. Look, nothing crazy happened. No dragons came out of the walls. The earth did not swallow me up. My childhood trauma did not all come back. Nothing at all happened. Great. So tomorrow I'm going to try 100 milligrams. I'm going to see if I notice something with that. I don't think I noticed anything. Great. The next day, go to 150. Oh, yeah, I kind of slowed down a little bit. I felt a little softer around the edges. That's how I like to self-describe my benefits with microdosing have helped me go from being a very sharp and pointy type A, coming from a very strong religious background, military background, oldest of 7 kids. My coping mechanism was to try and control the heck out of everything and everyone around me because somehow I felt like that made the world feel safer for me, which of course is a big fallacy. I wasn't controlling any of those things anyway. I was just kind of poking all the people around me with my sharp, pointy edges. With microdosing, soft, curly Q type A. It doesn't change who you are, but softening those edges to be able to be more open, more accepting, not trying to control everything, realizing what is in my control and what's out of my control. Most of what we get to control is our responses to life, right? Life is stimulus, response. If this happens, what do we want to do with it? How are we going to respond? But these responses and these coping mechanisms that we've come up with have been self-protective. It is survival. We are wired to survive at our most basic foundational state. But over time, we don't need the same survival techniques and tools that we've had in the past. Now they're harmful to us. They are not helpful to our relationships. They're not helpful to us getting what we want out of our life. They are holding us back because they keep us in a shell. They keep this hard, rigid edge around us. When we drop that down, we realize that other people also have these sharp, rigid edges up, but that's their self-protection as well. So who can benefit from microdosing? Everybody. Literally. Every single human has ingrained ways of thinking that are fully self-protective and not helpful to them in every aspect of their life. This is not a judgment, it's just the way that we evolve. It's the way that we learn, it's the way we survive in the environments that we're put in. But the cool thing about that is if these things have been learned, we can choose to do something different. Notice I didn't say we want to unlearn. No, information is power, right? We want to keep what we have learned, but we want to choose a different response. And we get an opportunity to choose a different response when that default mode network quiets down and we're no longer being controlled by emotional responses. So when I hear people say things like, well, I just want to feel my feelings, like, okay, that's great. Go do that by yourself. But when you're ready to make rational, healthy decisions, it is not going to be based on how you feel. It's not going to be based on what your body tells you to do. The body is a physiological organism that is built for survival. If we just go based off of how we feel, then we're constantly fluctuating. You know, that if we think of that term, hangry, right? Hungry and angry being put together, what is that? That's the body saying, I feel something, and I'm allowing the way I feel to determine how I'm going to respond to other people. So, as clinicians, when we look at a book like the DSM-5 and we talk about diagnoses, that is helpful for clinicians. That's why it was developed. So that we don't have to call each other up or send an email that says, hey, I have a client that has all of these symptoms, you know, kind of racing mind, high blood pressure, increased pulse, clammy and sweaty. Oh, we're going to call that anxiety. Let's just call it that. Then we kind of know what somebody's experiencing. But we've taken these terms and they've become labels that we as humans start to take on and define ourselves with. And now we hear things like, oh, yeah, that was my BPD. Oh, that was my PTSD. Like these diagnoses are alters to the self. Hi, my name's Charity. This is my BPD. This is my PTSD. This is my anxiety. We all come as a package. You know, instead of, hi, my name's Charity, and here's some of the things I've been through in life. Or I know the things I've been through and how they've impacted me, but I don't want those to impact and poke all the people around me anymore. I want to determine what kind of life I have. So it is a separation from what has happened in the past and the emotions that get connected to that, and where are we now, and how do we want to experience life now? Otherwise, we stick with this ball and chain of things that have happened in the past, old information, old ideas, old beliefs, old labels. Quieting down that default mode network makes a massive difference with that, enhancing neuroplasticity, getting out of that rigid way of thinking, and it starts with 1/32 of a teaspoon of mushroom that literally grows in poop if you want to go find it in the cow patty. Or you can go to a more trusted source these days, find out about their cultivation methods, how you want to acquire it, that sort of thing. But a microdose is not just based off the dose itself. It is based off of how the individual responds to it. Our clinic works with clients who dose as high as a gram or more on a daily basis. And that is the dose that helps them be able to drive a car, go to work, show up for their friends, family, pets responsibilities. So we do not sit in judgment of you're not microdosing if you're doing this dose. Well, number one, we don't sit in judgment anyway. But again, that microdose is individualized. I've been microdosing for over 4 years now. My dose is still 0.05 of a gram. Hasn't changed. I don't dose every day anymore, but I know how it's helpful to me. It is really helpful when hormones start going a little bit nutsy because when that estrogen starts to fluctuate a little bit, then psilocybin is really helpful in impacting some of those same areas where there's estrogen depletion, and there can be an enhancement with psilocybin. But I've come to understand it as a tool, and that dose, though, hasn't changed. And I know if I take a little bit too much, like, whew, my head feels a little bit weird, right? Doesn't mean I'm not functioning, but it does mean that's not how I'm trying to show up and feel on a daily basis. The half-life of psilocybin or psilocin is 2 hours and 43 minutes. That is a very short half-life. The goal is not to have the supplement built up in the system. That's where we start looking at what are some of the differences. Again, back with SSRIs, we have to find that maintenance dose that's based off the half-life of all those chemical compounds. With psilocybin, we have one thing we're working with. The half-life is very short. We want those benefits. That's why we dose on a daily basis. Get those benefits, get that structural functional change happening and that healing happening, and then you don't have to ever microdose again if you don't want to. You will understand how it's helpful to you. So real quick, some of these benefits: reduce anxiety and depression symptoms, reduce trauma symptoms, reduce cravings. I hear people say, I just don't smoke weed the way I used to. I just don't think about alcohol the way that I used to. I don't eat emotionally the way that I used to. Those cravings are, I need to cover up the way I'm thinking. I need to cover up the way I feel. I'm uncomfortable. Humans hate being uncomfortable. We will go to very high measures to alleviate discomfort. But often that doesn't lead to a healthy outcome in our lives for what we want. Greater sense of contentment, more creativity. I will write you a research paper before I will be able to draw you any sort of meaningful picture. That is for sure. So when I have to work on marketing materials or trying to think about something in a new way, those are days that microdosing can be really helpful to me. More restful sleep. We don't lay in bed awake because the body's not tired. We lay in bed awake because the brain will not be quiet. When we quiet that default mode network, reduce blood flow to the amygdala, we sleep better. Enhanced serotonin also contributes to sleep and serotonin benefits. Quieter mind, enhanced relationship with self and others, a lot less self-focused. Again, quieting down the idea of the self, that egocentric aspect that we have. It's not so much about how does this all affect me. Now it's I'm just showing up and being. How does that impact you? More focus, new neural connections. So we talked a little bit about finding that dose, again, very individualized. The dose that is helpful to you is where you find benefit. So you start low, go slow. But you can change that dose every day, and you can microdose every day. Again, body does not develop a tolerance to it when you're microdosing. You will hear people say, oh, I used to do a 5-gram journey and now I have to do a 6-gram journey or a 7-gram journey. When we are significantly disrupting the serotonin system, the body is going to make accommodations for that. That's what macrodoses do. They significantly disrupt the serotonin system. With microdosing, we're not causing a significant disruption. We are enhancing what is naturally already there that has become modified over time. Right? The destructive part has been all the stress, trauma, blah, blah, blah that we've been through. That's created a structural and functional change. The healing is using something natural to help the brain get back to its natural state of being. It is very individualized. I cannot tell you, even after working with 1,000 people at this point in time, I cannot say, oh, this is your height, weight, gender, BMI, here's your dose. It doesn't work that way. It is what does your brain need? If you are currently on SSRI medications, you might find that you need a higher dose. But notice I said might. That's not even always for sure either. So start low, go slow, but don't get caught up on the dose itself. Well, I'm taking a 0.5 gram every day and I'm just now starting to notice some benefits. Great, let's increase to 550. Let's go to 600 milligrams or 0.6 of a gram. Let's find where you're really finding benefits. And then you can titrate off those meds if you want to, which is typically the goal. So don't get stuck on the number. The number is just a way to measure so that you know what the dose is for you that's helpful. Do not use these with MAOIs though. MAOIs slow down the metabolism of serotonin itself. Like we talked about, psilocin is attaching to that serotonin receptor. So MAOIs are not used very commonly anymore, but if you are on an MAOI, then that is something you would want to discontinue before microdosing. That is the only medication, though, that I will say has a negative correlation directly tied to it. Start low, work your way up. Dose daily. Your brain will let you know what it needs, and trust yourself. You don't need me. You don't need somebody else in a white lab coat. You don't need somebody who's a lifetime mycologist to tell you what your microdose is. Listen to your body. That is such a huge part of microdosing is learning to trust yourself. Find these benefits and how they're helpful to you. Pay attention to what your body's telling you. So what strain of mushroom do I use? The strain, especially when we're talking about microdosing, is incredibly important. Oh my goodness, time has gone very quickly. I'm going to wrap this up. But the strain is incredibly important. We want a moderate psilocybin content and a low psilocin content. Remember, psilocin is that active metabolite in there. That is where the hallucinogenic experience is going to come from. So if you're doing a large dose, you can use pretty much whatever mushroom you want to. But in using a smaller dose and with microdosing, we want to use a very gentle mushroom with a moderate psilocybin, low psilocin content. Golden Teacher is what we recommend. It is a strain of Psilocybe cubensis, very moderate, very gentle. That is the one that we as a clinic always recommend that people start with. Also, it's not a hybrid of any sort. It exists as Golden Teacher in nature. Get it from a trusted source. Know how it's cultivated. We use an organic substrate, no asbestos in the processing, non-GMO grain, no pesticides or manure. That's something that one of our companies does. That's our cultivation method. But if you're doing it yourself or you're working with someone else, just ask those questions. Educate yourself. These are kind of the core things to look at. But it is important to know how it's cultivated. You are putting this into your body. So you want it to be as clean as possible. You can get it already cultivated. There's a lot of different ways to do that now. Make sure, again, it's a trusted source. And that means talk to somebody that knows the science, that knows why the strain is important. Do not go take something that's, oh, I put 30 different strains together because everybody connects with something. Yeah, well, what if they don't connect with the other 29? That's not, you want to pick one thing and change one thing at a time. Also, do not recommend stacking. There are common stacks out there. I put this with lion's mane, I put it with niacin, or I add some turkey tail to it, or various other things. Psilocybin will do what psilocybin needs to do all by itself. You don't have to do anything to it. You don't need to overcomplicate it. So know your strain of mushroom. When people come to me and say, oh yeah, I tried microdosing, it made my anxiety worse, or it's just not for me, or, well, what strain of mushroom did you use? Oh, I don't know. Well, what dose was it? Well, I don't know. It's some capsule somebody gave me. So you don't know exactly what it was. You don't know exactly how much it was. What if we were to start at ground zero where you know the strain and you start low and go slow again? So strain matters, trusted source, you can cultivate or grow your own. As clinicians, some of these best practices, and we'll kind of wrap up with this in a little bit of just touching on the law. The therapeutic component of changing perspective is what we're all about. That is what therapy is. We want a shift in perspective. How are we thinking about life? Microdosing enhances those positive therapy outcomes because it connects to the areas of the brain connected to thought itself and perspective. Consider microdosing as a clinician. Understand how it helps you. See how it changes the way that you work with your clients, the way that you think about things. Even if you decide not to do that, though, spending time in a session like this just to learn more about it, knowing that there are alternatives out there, options for clients, that is a part of being, a well-informed clinician. So I appreciate all of you coming today for sure and being willing to listen in on this. Being able to provide some insight on new ideas. We're not going to tell our clients, hey, you need to go microdose. What do we say? Hey, this is something that's decriminalized now. Check into it. Here's some sources that I have, but feel free to look at these and then also look at some others. Have those reputable sources that you can refer people to and encourage clients to do their own research. This is an autonomy. We want them to do this on their own and make that decision for themselves. And then have some understanding of the law regarding psychedelics. So specifically within the state of Colorado, Proposition 122 was the legislature that went up for discussion back in November of 2022. Coloradoans did vote yes for it. It became a state bill, State Bill 23-290, was signed into law in January of 2023. It is now decriminalized. What does that mean? That means you can have it, gift it, share it, drive around with it, grow it in your house in a contained space as long as it's no more than 12 by 12, fine print there. But You cannot sell psilocybin mushrooms. That is illegal. If you go to a shop and they are saying, hey, here's some mushrooms, you can buy these, retail, that is illegal. You can acquire mushrooms from individuals, and this is in the law, if it is within an agreement of harm reduction, therapy, spiritual guidance. Those give us three pretty good areas as clinicians to be able to work within. All clinicians are about harm reduction, providing therapeutic aspect of some sort. And then there's some psychedelic churches that exist now if they want to go more into that spiritual practice or if people are working with these larger doses. So if you want to obtain mushrooms, find a trusted source, find a individual or a company that is working within the law, which is a therapeutic agreement or harm reduction agreement or a spiritual agreement, and you can obtain mushrooms that way. Individuals over the age of 21, again, you can grow, possess them, share them, gift them. You cannot lose a state occupational license. You can use them while you're on probation. If you are using psilocybin for mental health purposes in a DHS case, that cannot be held against you. For people that are trying to work on child custody cases, it is not tested for on a urine drug test because, again, remember that half-life is 2 hours and 43 minutes. It's extremely challenging to test for that, especially when we're talking about taking between, on average, zero 0.1 and 0.5 of a gram. That's going to metabolize very quickly. Again, remember the goal with microdosing is not what do I feel? It's what do I notice? How is my perspective shifting? So I would love to take questions if there are any. I know we are a little bit over time. Thanks for sticking with me through this, but I really appreciate everyone being here.